All right, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Creating Videos for Scientists, Community Managers, and Beyond. We're very happy to have you all on. And before we get started, we want to ask kind of just what brought you all here today, because we're working with a couple different groups here. So if you could, there should be a poll on your screen. Could you just enter in what brought you here, whether it's a overriding interest in science communication, community science, or some combination of both. And I'll just leave this up for like a minute or two. All right, the last few folks, if you haven't voted yet. Awesome. Okay, so let's see. Oh no. All right. So what brought most of you here today is science communication, and then both, and then those looking just for community science. Well, lucky for all of you, we're covering all this stuff today. So that'll be very, very excited for all of that. Okay, so enough of this intro stuff. So first off, who exactly are we? Who's talking to you right now? So we are part of AGU's Sharing Science Program and Thriving Earth Exchange. So the Sharing Science Program, for those of you who are unaware, our whole mission is to provide scientists with the skills, tools, resources, opportunities, whatever folks might need to communicate their science with literally any audience, whether it's your peers, your family, your friends, members of the press, policymakers, whoever that might be. And so we do this through a number of different ways. We're on a webinar right now. We also do this through workshops. We have a ton of online resources. Our Twitter is very active. We provide outreach opportunities, hands-on support, all types of different things. So we hope that if you haven't engaged with us before this webinar, that you will afterwards. And we'll have some stuff at the end as well. Who we actually are. So my name's Shane Hanlon. I am part of the Sharing Science Program proper. You will also hear from, later on in the webinar, my colleague Olivia Ambrosio, who is also part of Sharing Science, and then Lauren LaPuma, who works closely with us as part of our Public Information Office, which is our department, who is basically our press folks, but she is our video expert for the webinar. So more from them later. And then before we get into kind of the meat of today, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Natasha, who's going to briefly talk about the Thriving Earth Exchange.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Natasha Udugama. I am with the Thriving Earth Exchange, which is a program of the American Geophysical Union, which is leveraging our Earth and space scientists to work with communities around the country and increasingly around the world to collectively work on projects that address community priorities around climate change, natural hazards, and natural resources. So we have our mission, of course, at AGU is to promote discovery in Earth and space science for the benefit of humanity. And for the nearly 100 years of that science, our scientists have been very good at the first part of the mission, but not necessarily as much on bringing that to benefit humanity in a tangible way. And so that's what the Thriving Earth Exchange has been doing for the past now 5 years. So we are communities and volunteer scientists working together. So what is community science? So some of you, 2% of you, in fact, said that you came to this webinar because you were interested in community science. So community science is this idea of communities and scientists working together to advance a local priority. The problem that we've come across is that communities don't necessarily have access to the science that they need to tackle those pressing priorities related to sustainability, resilience, climate change, and pollution. And so by doing community science, we are working with communities in all these different ways by first asking questions, developing methods, collecting data, analyzing that data, drawing conclusions, applying results, and then showing some local impact and sharing the results with other communities that might also be able to use the work that those community teams are coming up with. So by doing community science, we are inspiring innovative research, we're engaging diverse communities, we're developing new skills in scientists and opening up new career pathways for your science. We're advancing science learning, we're increasing the support for science, and most importantly, we're making impact. So the Thriving Earth Exchange does community science in a 4-stage process. We essentially work directly with community leaders to listen and find ways where Earth and space science can advance those community priorities in climate change, natural hazards, and natural resources. We then match scientists that have not only the right technical skills, but also the right collaborative skills. We then, once those teams are matched with their scientists, we help to coach, troubleshoot, project manage, and ensure those teams reach their goals. And then, most importantly, we help those teams to share and document the results, tools, and lessons learned for reuse and adaptation elsewhere. And you'll see this little icon about we are looking for volunteers. If you have any questions about that later, I'll be happy to elaborate. Just to give you some examples of sort of where our science is having impact. In the city of Eugene, Oregon, the community leaders there wanted to understand how the city could achieve a 350 parts per million greenhouse gas emission target. We were able to bring a professor from the University of Portland to help sort of do a peer review. And while they did not achieve this specific target, they were able to convince the Eugene City Council for it to do a 7 to 8% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And then in the city of New Orleans, in the 7th Ward, we've been working with a community group there to understand sort of the heat island effects and to improve social well-being in New Orleans. They've been able to now produce heat maps and track community response after greening efforts. Finally, in the city of Berlin, Maryland, local to AGU here, we were able to save a small town out in Berlin about $5 million in remediation costs because of the community effort of a scientist working with that particular community. So why are we, and then I have another one, I'm sorry. And then in the city of Pittsburgh, we were able to work with the city's sustainability office to help them develop a greenhouse gas inventory. And because of the work that was done in Pittsburgh, the city of Atlanta and the city of Durango, Colorado, have both adopted a similar methodology. So why are we here? Why is Thriving Earth Exchange partnering with Sharing Science on this particular webinar? Because videos are really important for community science efforts. They're inherently personal and context specific. The videos augment the storytelling that community science projects ought to do and are doing. The projects feature personal dynamics between community leaders and scientists that capturing videos versus static images further that narrative. Capturing videos can also support those teams in obtaining further funding. Oftentimes, Thriving Earth Exchange projects are just a stepping stone to larger projects that cities and communities might want to undertake. And then videos are the most authentic way to capture community voices. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Natasha. So we're really excited to partner with Thriving Earth Exchange. So those of you who are here for that specifically, we hope that you get something out of this. Those of you who have never heard of Thriving Earth Exchange before, please check them out. And then also, this is geared in this direction, but all the tips we're going to provide today are useful no matter who you are. If you're a scientist, if you're a community manager, if you're just a science enthusiast. So now we're going to get into kind of the meat of what we're here to talk about today. When communicating science, no matter how you're doing it, whether it's video, audio, in person, writing, whatever it is, it's so important to think about who you're talking to first. And there are so many different audiences out there. If it's in person, there's museums, might be policymakers or service groups. You can do it online. You can do it through multimedia, and video, which is what we're talking about today. So it's just incredibly important to think about who you're talking to so you know what your message should be. You should know what they care about, what their ideas are or ideals are, what really matters to them. When you think about your audience, you want to be able to connect with them. So think about, right? What are your goals first? Like, what do I want to get out of this? What do I want to do and why do I want to do it? But again, think about your group's goals too. So talking to maybe the members of a non-science public, maybe like a community group, their goals are going to be much different than maybe a chamber of commerce or a different type of policymaker. Think about who's in that group. Like, what are their demographics? What do they care about? What are their interests? What are their concerns? Because as much as you can, you should try to shape and frame your message to these different types of groups depending on what they care about. And then think about why your message matters to this group or why you hope it matters to this group. We have this joke. This is a cartoon that Olivia drew. We are both PhDs by training, so did the whole research route. And she jokes, and I can most certainly sympathize maybe with this, that from painful personal experience, we were both this way. We just didn't understand why people didn't want to listen to what we were talking about with our research because we weren't thinking about why they would care in the first place. So some painful personal experience that we've hopefully grown from. But it's important to frame that message. And framing isn't necessarily about convincing someone or persuading someone of something. It's about presenting your knowledge, your message, whatever it might be. Again, we're talking about this from a scientist perspective, but this is any sort of communication, talking to really anyone. And it's about presenting what you're trying to message in a way that's important to who you're talking to. And one effective way that we've seen this done, and we've done personally, is this idea of like, we all care about. And it could be none of these things we have listed, but depending on who your group is or who your audience is, maybe it's children's future or health or the economy or national identity or any number of things. So thinking about a way to frame what you're talking about to matter to the people you're talking to is always kind of that first and very important step. And so just some examples. So why should your science, or again, maybe it's whatever your message is, matter to this group? Are you talking to homeowners about hurricanes and from an economic perspective? But are you talking to ski resorts about climate change and snowpack and an impact on their bottom line? Talking about heat waves and energy bills, whatever it might be, framing your message is incredibly important and will ensure that it resonates with your audience. So that's just kind of like this brief idea of like things you need to think about no matter what your message is, no matter who you're talking to. But this is especially important when thinking about sharing science via multimedia, specifically video. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Lauren, who is going to guide you through this process.
Great, thanks, Shane. Thanks for that wonderful introduction from you guys. So first off, we're just going to say, and Natasha already covered this a little bit, but why video? And you guys are all here to learn about video, so I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit, but video is such an important medium and such a great medium for communicating science. So just one quick little background about me. So I've been at AGU for almost 4 years now. So as Shane mentioned, I work in our press office, and my job is to publicize the newsworthy research that's coming out in our journals and that is presented at our meetings. And I do this mainly through many ways, but the main two ways I do it are through writing, so writing press releases and blogs, and through video. And so I've been here now, let's see, almost 4 years, and I've produced probably about 20 to 25 videos for AGU. And so the things that I can tell you and why video is so great for communicating science is that, well, first of all, vision just trumps all other senses. We are visual beings by nature. That's just how we are. You know, so much more of our brain is dedicated to processing visual information than processing any other kind of sensory information. And so we actually learn and remember best through photos and images and video, through pictures. So this is a really great medium for communicating in general. And then if you're looking at the content that is being created nowadays on the internet, most of it is video-based. And this is only going to increase as we go forward in the future. So it's this opportunity that you as scientists can take advantage of to jump on this. And then again, science really lends itself to visual media, especially video, because it's so visual-based. There's amazing, images and things, whether you're working it with a community, whether you're working in the field or in the lab, there are just so many ways to describe your science through visual media. And so here's just 2 examples of some videos that we've done recently at AGU. They cover different topics. They are, explaining concepts, for example, like why some icebergs are the color green. Or they might be describing new research. So the bottom one is research that describes the source of the world's largest mud volcano eruption. So there are so many different ways to communicate science through video. And so I'm going to give you guys today basically some tips and hacks that I have gathered over the years of making videos. And so I've structured this in 2 parts. The first part is just the creative part. So this is how are you telling your story? So as Jane mentioned, you first want to think about your audience. And so the things I say is first define these 3 things: audience, purpose, and scope. And this part is absolutely the most important part, and it's probably the hardest part. The actual creating the video is not that hard once you have all this done. And I really suggest especially when you're starting out making videos, really lay these out, write them down with a lot of detail. Really think about exactly what you're doing. And so Shane touched on this already, thinking about your audience. You want to think about who they are, what their viewpoint is, And again, another thing you want to think about is what do they already know about what you're communicating? And so how is what you're communicating different from what they already know? What is the new thing that you want to tell them? And then think about your purpose. Why? Why are you doing this? What are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to inform? Are you trying to entertain? Are you trying to motivate? Is there a call to action? For example, if your audience is policymakers, do you want them to vote a certain way on a piece of legislation? Are you trying to get people to recycle more or to support science funding? Things like that. So think about that. What story are you telling? And how is what you're making different, again, from what's already being told? Why are you doing this? If the story you're telling has already been told somewhere else, maybe there isn't as much of a use for that. So maybe you want to modify it to be different than what already exists. And the last part is the scope. That's what. What are you going to make and how are you going to make it? Who and what are the subjects of your video? What is your story? What is the idea or ideas you're trying to convey? And then think about what assets in terms of visual assets do you already have and what do you need? For example, are you going to go out and shoot raw footage yourself and use that? Are you going to use still images? Are you going to use stock footage that already exists somewhere? What do you already have and what do you need to do? And most often people use a combination of those things. And then think about who are the people that you need to talk to help tell this story? Who should be involved in this project? So obviously we're talking about video, so visuals really need to drive the story. And if you can't find good visuals or you can't imagine what visuals would illustrate the story, it's probably not right for video. That's probably not going to apply to most of you. Like science lends itself really well to video, but just think about that. Think about you have to have visuals drive the story. And I always try to lead or open my videos with the most interesting visuals to hook the viewer in right away. This is important because people have really short attention spans, and if they're not interested in a video in the first 10 seconds, they're just not going to watch it anymore. So here's kind of my steps or my process for creating a video, and this is very kind of loose. They're kind of loosely gathered here. The first thing I do is once I have settled on the idea or the concepts I want to convey, I basically create a storyboard. And this is not really an official storyboard. It's kind of loose. But what I do is essentially list out the ideas that I want to convey or the story arc that I imagine, and pair that with the visuals that I have or the visuals that I imagine or the visuals that I'm going to gather. For example, if I'm going to interview someone or go out and shoot, footage of a landscape, for example. So I basically pair my written part with my visual part, and then I basically work those two. I basically modify each one based on the other. So my visuals will complement my written story or the script, and the script will complement the visuals or accurately describe the visuals. And I go through many rounds of revision with this. Maybe I have a visual and it doesn't quite match what my script says, so I need to adjust one of those so that they line up more correctly. So then I go about, if there are any visuals I don't have, I go about collecting them or producing them, shooting video or shooting photos and putting them all together. So like I said, I just kind of adjust them to complement each other, and then I arrange them in an order that makes sense. And this is all, just so that they make logical sense, that they, follow a narrative arc or a storyline, that it's something that a viewer can easily follow. So a couple tips for doing interviews that I have found that are helpful. First is save the good questions for on camera. What I mean by this is often, so if you're interviewing someone for your video, you usually will do a pre-interview, which is you'll talk to them ahead of time and get a sense of what their story is. You may already know this person and have an idea of that already, so you may not have to pre-interview them. But the questions that I really want to ask in a video, I won't ask them until we're rolling, because often if I ask it in the pre-interview, the person will give me this great, spontaneous, engaging answer. And then when I ask it again on camera, they're kind of just repeating what they've already said, and they lose a lot of that emotion or that excitement. So that's why I like to save it for when we're actually on camera. And then ask open-ended questions. Basically, I say to them, tell me about this. Tell me about a time when this happened. Tell me the story of this, so that they basically speak in complete sentences and they tell you a whole story and they're not just answering yes or no questions. And then recognize that the camera is an intimidating presence in the room. I am totally included in this. Many people are the same. When I can get up and I can speak in front of people, I can do things like this, like webinars. The second you put me in front of a camera, I freeze up and I just get really nervous and awkward. And lots of people, this happens to a lot of people because the camera is really intimidating. So to mitigate that, just be over present in the conversation, so that really have the person engage with you rather than the camera. So take their focus off this intimidating presence and have their focus on you. So, like I said, all your video projects are going to have a script of some sort. It may be a narration, like a voiceover, or it could just be captions that appear on the screen. It's usually not going to just be video with nothing else, no description whatsoever, because you do need to provide some context. So when you're writing a script, whether you're using narration or captions, like I said before, your visuals and your script should complement each other. I would prefer to keep my narration short, and I use it basically to connect ideas that aren't conveyed by the visuals or by the interviews with the subjects in the video. I went to a video seminar once, and one of the speakers gave this great analogy. She said, think of the narration as the bridge over the water where the story lives. So you're basically using it just to connect ideas, help the video flow logically so that people can follow it, but you don't want to have too much. You really want the visuals to drive the story. And then when I look at the interviews I've done with subjects, what I do is I look through and I find those moments of humanity where the person is really excited, where they show emotion, where they're engaged. And I take those clips and I basically build a story around them. This helps the audience connect with this person and be much more engaged in the story. So now, some tips for the technical aspect of it, like actually how do you create this piece of video. So if you're shooting video, there's a couple things, and so you have a couple options. The main things I want to give you guys here are some life hacks for showing you how to do this easily and quickly and on the cheap. You do not need expensive equipment, because let's face it, none of us have access to cinema quality cameras just lying around. They're really expensive, but there are really good options you can use. You can use a smartphone. You could even use a DSLR regular still camera. Most of them have video capabilities too. So you have options, and you can use either one of those to create video. And they both work really well. So my first piece of advice is just wherever you go, whether you're in the lab, whether you're working with a community, whether you're in the field, wherever you go, shoot video and take photos all the time. Just document everything. Pretend you're on a documentary film crew and just take as many visuals as you can, because you never know what might be useful later on down the road. And the biggest tip I can tell you, and if you take away nothing else from this talk, take away this. If you're using a smartphone, always turn it horizontally. We forget to do this a lot, and we're used to holding our phones vertically, but all the main video platforms are all based in landscape orientation. They're horizontal, so always turn your phone. The one exception to this is Instagram stories. So unless you are making a video specifically for an Instagram story, always turn your phone. It will just look so much better, and it's so much easier to work with in editing. And then when you can, use a tripod just to stabilize your shot, because we all have shaking hands. Even when we think we are really steady, there's always some shake that's going to appear in the video. And luckily, there are some really cheap tripods you can get, even for iPhones, that are not very expensive. You can get them on Amazon. Here's two examples on the right over there. There's one that's kind of like has these squishy legs that can wrap around something. And there's one that looks more like a traditional tripod that is just for a smartphone. So lighting is always a concern, something you have to think about when you're shooting video, just as it is in photography or any other visual medium. And if you're outdoors, you're probably going to be okay, unless it's at night, but hopefully you're not shooting that much at night. If you're indoors, I can tell you I do a lot of indoor photography, and there's never, ever, ever enough light indoors. Unless you are in a television studio or a really brightly lit fluorescent room, there's never enough light. So add light whenever you can. And this doesn't have to be hard. You can actually go to Home Depot or other home improvement stores and get those cheap construction lights that they sell for not that much, and just add those up and just to add some more light into your room. You can also use reflectors to better point the light towards your subject. So you can go out and get those car shades, those car windshield shades that keep your car cool in the summertime. They are literally designed to reflect light. So you go get one and you hold it up and have someone stand there and basically hold it up opposite your subject so that it reflects light onto their face. So that way their face is better lit. There's not too many shadows or too few shadows. Just looks a little bit better. If you're outside, make sure the sun, if you're the one shooting, make sure the sun is behind you so that it's not behind the subject. Because if it's behind your subject, then if they're going to be backlit, they're going to be kind of like a silhouette. It's not going to look very good. Another tip is to use open shade. So if you're outside, try not to be in direct sunlight. Try to find open shade, which is basically where you're still outside, you're not covered, but the sun is not directly hitting you. So there's this example here on the bottom of this young boy. So on the left, he's in direct light, and you can see that he's squinting. You can't really see his eyes. There's lots of shadows on his face. But when he goes to open shade, now you can actually see his face better. There's no shadows. You can see his beautiful blue eyes. It just looks much better. And so if you're shooting on an iPhone or a smartphone, you can actually adjust the exposure. So if there isn't enough light, you can actually increase it. And I'm sorry I can't actually show you this physically, but if you open up, for example, on your iPhone and go to your video or your camera, if you just hold your finger on the screen, this little yellow box will appear with the sun next to it. And you can drag the sun up and down to adjust the exposure. I've used this many times. It's really, really helpful. So when you're shooting your subject or whatever you're shooting, I always try to include people. Even if I'm shooting landscapes or scenery, anything like that, I always try to include people because we're people and we like people. We think people are interesting. And so a shot will always be more interesting if there's a person in it than if there's not. And then also try to include action and emotion. So you don't want to just show a person sitting or standing, being still, not doing anything. That's just boring. You want to show them actually doing something. So in these two examples here in these photos, the top one on the left, it's hard to see, her face is very small, but this scientist is inside a glacier actually. She's inside an ice cave, and she's just looking up at this beautiful cave system with this look of awe and wonder. So that's really capturing the emotion of that experience for her. The example on the right, on the bottom, is another scientist still inside this ice cave system, and you see her like writing things down, or maybe she's sketching. So you see her actually physically doing work. So that just makes it more engaging and compelling. So when you're actually composing your shot, there's two rules, or one rule and one tip. The first is the rule of thirds, and you probably already know this rule in your head. It's kind of common sense, but maybe you just hadn't heard it defined before. The rule of thirds is if you take the frame of your camera and you split it up into thirds, both vertically and horizontally, so you basically divide it up into 9 rectangles, what you want to do is place your subject or the most interesting parts of the shot at the intersections of those lines. So in this example here on the bottom left, you can see that this person, their face is very close to that intersection of the bottom 2 lines. It's not exact, it doesn't have to be perfect, but it's right around that area. And what this does is it draws the viewer's eye to around the frame, so they don't just focus on the center. So it just makes it a little bit more interesting, and they spend more time looking at the image or the shot. Another thing that's really good to do is to show scale. So this image on the right is this beautiful glacier in Antarctica, and without those people in it, you really wouldn't, it's very beautiful, but you wouldn't be able to tell how big it is. But by showing the people next to it, you could actually see its true size, which makes it more impressive. And I actually have an example of how showing scale can be really powerful in video. So this is a clip from a documentary called Amazon Gold that was made about 10 years ago about gold mining in the Peruvian Amazon. And I'll just let the shot play and you guys can see what it looks like.
And I'm just going to pop in here real quick. For those of you who weren't on earlier, we were getting some questions. You can just type questions, a little question box. You can just type those in, and we'll get to everything at the end. So back to you, Lauren.
Great, thanks, Shane. Great. And so you also want to think about varying your shots. And so you may not know the names of all the different kinds of shots, and you can go look them up there, but most of them you probably have seen, you just didn't know what they were called. There's close-ups, there's medium shots, wide shots. There's something called an establishing shot, which is you will see this in every single movie and every single TV show you've ever watched. The establishing shot is just at the very beginning of a scene. It's a shot, a very wide shot of the scenery, basically to set the scene to show the audience where the characters are. So for example, if you guys remember the TV show Seinfeld, they always had a shot of the outside of the diner right before they would go to George and Jerry sitting in the diner. So as soon as you saw that shot, you're like, okay, now I know I'm going to go see George and Jerry and Elaine and Kramer in the diner. So establishing shots are really useful in film and TV. Shoot B-roll. And B-roll is, if you're interviewing a person, B-roll is all the additional video footage that is like supplementary to your actual interview. So for example, if I'm interviewing my grandmother and she says, you know, every day I get up at 5 a.m. and I go down to the diner and I have my scrambled eggs and my coffee, I will shoot some footage of her going to the diner, going in, interacting with the waitstaff, getting her coffee, eating her scrambled eggs. And during the video, we will cut to that footage interspersed throughout the interview, because we're not just going to watch an entire video of one person talking. That would be very boring. So that's what B-roll does. It just keeps it visually interesting while you're still listening to what the person is saying. And on iPhones and smartphones, you can actually play with time-lapse videos and slow motion, which can be super fun. So I just totally recommend going out and playing around with those. If you're doing interviews, you can use this shot called over the shoulder. And this is used, you have definitely seen this everywhere in every movie and TV show. You just may not have known what it was called. So these two photos on the right are both over the shoulder shots, but there's one difference, and I'll explain what it is. So in the top photo, it's called an over the shoulder shot. So you see this top photo, you see the Joker and Batman. And it's called over the shoulder because we're looking at the Joker, who is the subject right now, over the shoulder of the person he's talking to. So you see Batman's head and his shoulder in the shot. So that is called a dirty over the shoulder shot because you actually see Batman's shoulder in there. The bottom one of Luke Skywalker here, that is also an over the shoulder shot, but you don't actually see the other person. So that's called a clean over the shoulder. Doesn't really matter the terminology, just know that that's where the shot is coming from. That's where the camera is placed. It just helps put things in context for a conversation. It makes things more interesting. And the subject is always going to be on 1/3 of the screen. It might be the right third or it might be the left third. That goes back to that whole rule of thirds principle. So it's going to be on one of those lines. There we go. All right. So when you're doing audio or conducting interviews, always use a microphone whenever you can. The audio will just sound much, much better. If you're writing a script and you're planning on doing a voiceover narration, always, before you actually record it, make sure you read it aloud several times and maybe have someone else listen to it as well. Oftentimes, I will write a script and the way I write something is very different from the way I might say it. And so it might sound weird speaking these words as opposed to when it's written. Also, sometimes I find that I might stumble over some of the wording. I may want to change it up. So always just read it aloud and practice it beforehand to get a sense of that. You can record audio interviews even on your iPhone on that voice memos app. That works really well. Or you can get a handheld digital voice recorder. Those also work really well. You can also get some ambient sounds, and this is what we call audio B-roll. So it's just ambient sounds of wherever you are. So let's say you're out in the jungle and you just record some sounds of the insects and the other animals, the birds, chirping and croaking and all of that, just to set the scene and give the audience a sense of time and place. And also, wherever you are, whether you're inside or outside, always be sure to record some room tone. And what that means is turn on your recorder before anyone starts talking. Just record like 5 or 10 seconds of silence. That just captures the background ambient noise of the room, and that way, later on, you can get rid of that noise in your editing software if you want to. So when it comes to editing, you have lots of options. If you're just going to trim some clips down, you can use your smartphone, your iPhone, or your iPad. You can do this really easily. You can even if you have a slow motion video, you can actually adjust which parts of your video are in slow motion and which parts are in normal time. So that's really good. Just if you're maybe going to post some videos to social media, you're not really going to put different shots together. If you're looking at something more complex and you want to combine different shots, arrange them in a certain way, add all these things we talked about, narration and script and all of that, then you want to use either basic software or pro software. So there's different basic software options out there, and you can do a lot of things. It can rearrange clips, add music, add captions, but it's a little bit limited in terms of the freedom that you have. So it really just depends on kind of what time investment and financial investment you want to make. If you really want to go the whole haul, you can use the pro software, and Adobe Premiere is the go-to now. It's the gold standard. It can do anything. It can do everything. It's such a powerful piece of software. It's wonderful. But again, it takes a long time to learn because it can do so many things. So if you want to invest the time in learning that's great. I totally recommend it. Or you could hire someone else to do the editing for you if that's not in your wheelhouse. You can also edit audio as well and use your same options. You have some free options, which are things like Audacity and GarageBand, or you have a pro software, which would be Adobe Audition. And then you want to, see if there's any additional elements you want to add. If you have just raw footage, do you want to add some still images in there, some stock images? Do you want to add graphics or animation and music music especially? So, and there are resources online where you can find all of these things that are free to use for non-commercial purposes. So they have a Creative Commons license or they're in a public domain. And here I've just given some examples of places you can go online to look. And if anyone wants more, you can reach out to me anytime and I'll give you some more links and resources. The top one, DigCC Mixter, that's actually a great site for finding music. That's all Creative Commons that you can use in your project. NASA, their scientific visualization studio is like the greatest untapped resource. Anything made by NASA is in the public domain. It can be used by anyone for non-commercial purposes. They have literally thousands of videos and animations on there that you can search through, and you can make videos using nothing but their stock footage or their stock animations. It's great. I've done it before. It's very, very useful. You can look on Flickr as well for anything with Creative Commons. And so now,
I got it.
Now we're just going to show a sample video, and the reason I just chose this video is it's very quick, and it's just to show you what you can do with only using a couple still images and one small piece of footage, so you can still make a video that looks polished and professional and that's interesting and engaging. Okay, so now I'm going to kick it back to Shane, who's going to talk about what's next.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren. So now you have a very quick but comprehensive guide to basically start your science video journey, let's call it. But once you make a thing, then what do you do with it? So say you make a video, what happens to that video? Well, one way to share it, possibly one of the more common or most common ways to share it, is through social media. There are a ton of platforms. This is only a smattering of them, of places to share videos. More on social media in a second. You can do it in your presentations. Again, for probably more of the from the scientist perspective, videos can be put into PowerPoints. They can be put into webinars. You've seen this done today. So videos can be shared through different types of presentations, or if you're giving a talk to a public non-science audience, or even if you're not a scientist and you want to give some sort of a presentation, videos can be really powerful. And they're really great from a media perspective. So if you are doing something really cool and you want journalists, like Lauren said, to pick your stuff up, videos are really attractive in that capacity. So you can make something, or chances are they might have something made as well. This is a lot of what Lauren does. But specifically, if you're interested kind of in the social media aspect of things, we actually have a follow-up and companion webinar scheduled to really complement the one we're on right now for the same time next week. And so that one is going to be social media for scientists, community managers, and beyond. Same time, same day of the week. You can find the registration at this tiny URL. Also, we will follow up with all of you after this webinar is completed. It'll be archived. We'll send a follow-up email. So this information will be in there as well. So if you're interested or want to pass it along to folks. So look for that. You can check out what AGU does in the science video realm for inspiration, or for tips and tools, or for critiques, whatever it might be. But we're on Facebook, so we have a lot of videos on our Facebook feed. We have a YouTube channel, that's American Geophysical Union. And we actually also post a bunch of videos to our Instagram feed, which is American Geophysical Union, all one word. So look for examples there, probably more of the from phone and maybe like camera, like point and shoot or DSLRs. Places to find those is probably best on our Facebook and Instagram, but all of those avenues, or all of those places are great places to find examples of videos. Speaking of social media, if you're on the social media, chances are that's probably how many of you found out about this today. We're on all the things. Obviously, there's a lot going on right here to pick up on all of this, but again, you'll get a copy of this afterwards, so you can follow us in different types of places, and then there we go. And then if you're interested in Thriving Earth Exchange, we're going to have some questions afterwards here. We have about 15 minutes, but you can find more about Thriving Earth Exchange here, through their Twitter, through Natasha, many different avenues. And finally, if you are interested in science communication more broadly, not just video, that type of thing, we are, this is what we do for a living. So we have a ton of stuff on our website. We have a really active Twitter, and I say that with no bias at all, being the one who manages a lot of our Twitter content. But also, if you want to be part of a community of folks interested in science communication, these are communicators, press folks, scientists, all different types of people who come together and share ideas, successes, failures, tips, tools, whatever else. Consider joining the Sharing Science community. We are an online community, an online communication forum dedicated to science communication, policy, outreach, all these different things. And so I'm going to go back a couple slides, throw up all of our social media stuff, and we have time for some questions that you've been typing. If you have questions, keep typing those in, and Olivia's going to be our, what's the word for it? I was going to say MC, that's not right. Moderator, that's better.
Yeah, so we've gotten some great questions so far, and I think let's just cover that first. Natasha, I think you can answer, which was about Thriving Earth Exchange and community science initiatives and whether there's an international component, and I wanted you to touch upon that.
Yes, yes, there is an international component. We currently have 7 international projects. The most recent one is actually still looking for scientists. It just went up last week in Linden, Guyana. And we hope to have more in the future. So yes, if you're interested in being part of being either a volunteer on that project or even volunteering to be a coordinator on some projects, we're actually starting to look for those in the future.
Great, thank you. One question, Lauren, this may be most to you, although others jump in if you have information. Love the tip about channeling your inner documentarian and shooting wherever and whenever. With this, how do you go about photo and video releases?
Good question. You can do something, really simple and there are definitely stock boilerplate photo and video release forms that you can find online, and you could download them and just kind of modify them for your purposes. Really all you want to do is just make sure that everyone that is involved in your video is okay with the video being disseminated, shot, put together and disseminated wherever it's going to be. And so you could have the people who are involved sign a release form like that. Really the only place where it gets tricky is when there's minors involved. So at AGU, we really try to avoid using minors or people who are under 18 when we can, unless we do have specific permission from the parent or guardian. So that's really the only kind of issue that you really need to be aware of. But most of the time, just ask people if they're okay with it, and if you want them to sign a release, that's great. It's not always necessary unless you're doing something that you think might be a little bit that people might be a little uncomfortable with. But it's pretty simple.
Thanks. We have a couple of related questions. People interested specifically in audio. One is more ideas for improving audio, particularly like music, sound techniques for radio shows, and also whether there are pro tools for audio production.
So the first part was improving audio for radio shows?
Well, so I'll pop in on this. I would say kind of just more generally, especially with audio, technique is oftentimes more important than tools per se. So what I mean by that is, if you're trying to get really good audio, ensuring that someone has a mic on them, and it doesn't matter what type of mic that is, versus trying to enhance the sound later, good technique is more important, because you can always you can always kind of fix things depending on what your type of audio you have if you have good technique, but you can improve technique on the back end. So if you can ensure that you're for interviews in a quiet spot, without many distractions, no noises, no say tapping on a table, that type of thing. So I'd say focus especially on what the interview is versus really worrying about having really fancy equipment. Having said that, like Lauren said, so Adobe, it's Audition for audio. is like the pro tool for all things audio. Now, it's great, but it's not necessary. Audacity is free, and it's really powerful, and it does a lot of really great work. Some of us use it personally. We have friends and colleagues and peers who do it. If you have a Mac, like GarageBand's really great. Didn't you say there used to be an old one, or is that a video one, a Microsoft one?
Windows
okay.
Maker. Yeah.
That's different.
Oh yeah, I can say that in a second. But yeah, I'll just add to audio stuff. Yeah, I mean, the equipment isn't as critical as Shane said, like technique. Technique is better, make sure if you have someone and they're talking into a handheld microphone, people tend to drop it, move it away from their face, move it back to their face. Just try to insist that they keep it as close to their mouth as possible. We say always, like eat the mic, like you're about to eat it. Use things like what's called a pop filter or a windscreen. It's like this little foam piece that goes over the microphone that blocks that puff of air that you make when you say the letter P, that pop. Those always really help. And if you're in a room, let's say that's kind of echoey, actually kind of like the room that we are in right now at AGU, you basically want to be in a room where you don't want to be in a box where sound can echo. You want to have things in the room that will break up the sound waves as they travel, and that will reduce the echo. So anything like plants, furniture, you can go all the way and get like actual sound padding, like acoustic panels, which aren't too expensive. I mean, if you want to like kind of build your own studio, you want to be as low to the ground as possible. So if you're in a building, be on the ground floor, don't be on the top floor. Just anything to break that up. Soft materials. You will fill your room with soft materials. Some people have even said if they have nothing else, they will just cover themselves with a blanket, put a blanket over their head, and just record, talk into a mic under there. That actually does help a lot because it just breaks up the sound waves. I think that was everything I wanted to say. Yeah.
We've had a couple of questions about sort of further tips generally, and also whether there'll be access to these slides later. And just to let you know, this webinar will be archived, and everyone who registered for it will be getting an email in about a week, right, Shane? And we'll include the link to that archived webinar. We'll also include some other links to resources that we have online that should give you a little bit more information in some of these areas as well. One other question that we have is how do you start and how do you get funding? I'm an undergrad science enthusiast and researcher who's wondering what would be the best place to start and have the most impact. I'm assuming this is with science communication. That's how I'm going to approach it, but if you want to address it from a community science perspective too, Natasha, I don't think it would hurt.
Okay, I was wondering actually if you meant starting to do videos. So there's many different ways we could take this. But in order to start community science projects, all community science projects start from the community. So we have connections, we have partnerships, what we call community-facing organizations. Organizations like the National League of Cities, the International City and County Managers Association, Rockefeller's 100 Resilient Cities, just to name a few. So community science projects are always started and sourced from the community. We then try to figure out where are the Earth and space science connections, and it's only then that we bring in scientists to work on those projects with those communities.
And then from like a science communication SciComm perspective, really it's just kind of like getting out there and just doing. So that could just be just talking to your friends about science. It could be talking to peers, family members. If you're actually doing research, just going to local museums or volunteer organizations and then just chatting with them like, hey, I do this. Maybe do you know anyone who'd want to hear about it? It's being on social media and just sharing what you do via that way, or talking, maybe starting a blog, or maybe just guest posting on a blog. There's no right or wrong way to do this. We've all, like all of us in this room, have very different paths of how we got here, but we all just kind of like learned by doing, and there was a lot of trial and error. And then finally, like just from a video perspective, I mean, that's why we're here today. It's just like Lauren said, just start shooting. You can always just have a ton of video and you can just mess around with it. And from there, if you realize you like it or you're good at it or whatever it might be, you can really experiment from there. But just trying and doing, it's like there's no kind of like downside to that. And And again, you don't need fancy equipment. You don't need all of these like pro tools. Honestly, it's just a matter of time and imagination when you get down to it.
Yeah, I would just add, like, yeah, go out and start shooting stuff and taking photos and all of that, and like just start playing around. Start posting videos to social media. Start playing around with the free software and see how you like it and see how it works for you. Oh yeah, I was gonna mention this earlier. Windows used to have this great program. I think it's probably still available on some computers, but not the new ones, called Windows Movie Maker. It was a fantastic like intro free editing software. It was great. So if you have that, just try it out, check it out. There are also tons of other like little online apps. Just check it out. Or if you know someone who does do editing, have them try to help you, give you a tutorial maybe. See if there are any classes on video editing, in your area. They can be really helpful just to learn the software. That's a big hurdle, but once you get to the basics, you can do pretty much, anything you want.
Great. One question about, do you have suggestions on best practices for how to structure interviews with scientists or non-science audiences? How do you help the interviewee translate their findings in a way that's successful?
Well, yeah, maybe Shane and Olivia can talk about helping them translate. No, I mean, a couple of different things. So I usually like to start off and just kind of let them talk. And I always, let them know up front, if it's for a general audience, try to tell them, it's for a lay audience. Try to keep it to the level of a high schooler. Remember that most adults, the last time they took a science class was high school, maybe chemistry or biology. They don't just have the background and the knowledge of the terminology. So keep it to the level of a high schooler. Use clear, simple terms. I will often ask questions, kind of like the same question multiple times, but in different ways, to see if they'll give me a different answer or if they'll explain it to me in a different way. If they're answering a question and they include a piece of jargon or a term that I don't know, I'll say, oh, okay, explain that to me. What does that mean? And another kind of fun game you can play is if the scientist is, inserting a lot of jargon into the interview or, a lot of terminology that you don't think will be understandable to the audience, and you don't want to keep interrupting them, because that does kind of break the flow of the interview sometimes. If you want to just kind of let them go, at the very end, you could do kind of like speed Jeopardy round, like, okay, this word, what does it mean? This word, what does it mean? Define it. And so just have them do that so that you can basically cut those pieces in to the finished product to help explain those terms.
We have some other questions. Well, one more thing on this that you can do sometimes is we have lots of resources on reducing jargon for scientists themselves to help them. You can also play with your friends. Go out for a drink and do a jargon tally with people you know who are not in your field. Try to tell them what you do. Have them check off how many words you're using that they did not understand. It can be very illuminating. Another question we have is, how do you estimate the amount of time involved in making a short video, both the actual shooting, interviewing, etc., and the editing and processing?
It's always really hard to estimate that ahead of time, but I can say that it will take longer than you think. It takes a lot of time. Hours and hours. It's kind of hard to give an estimate, but I can say that some rules of thumb I've heard is that, for every hour of shooting time that you have for a piece of, for a documentary film, for example, multiply that by 10, and that's how much time total it will take you. Now, of course, that depends on, what you're doing, and that's for kind of like a film project, but it takes a lot of time. For every minute of video that you make, I don't know, maybe 8 to 10 hours of work, in post-production, I would say. I mean, it's kind of hard to estimate, though, and it depends on the project, too. If you're just going to put together some footage and images that are already available to you, like stock images and things, and you can put them together quickly, that can happen, in not that much time. But if you're going out and you're shooting and you're doing interviews and putting all that together, it will take a lot more time commitment.
And then one question, and maybe we'll get to this more next week, but if you're uploading shorter content on, say, YouTube, how can you maximize traffic and reduce the odds of getting lost in the cyber vastness?
Yeah, that'll definitely be something we talk about next week. But the short answer is it's about, I'm going to say marketing, and that might be a word that some folks don't necessarily like or aren't familiar with. But it's basically how you pitch your your science. It's about framing. We talked about framing earlier, or I talked about framing earlier. The video itself, if it's on YouTube, that's its home. Chances are, if you're just starting out, folks aren't going to go to YouTube and just find your video or wherever it's living. So it's a matter of sharing it through the channels that you currently have. So talking to friends, colleagues, peers, using social media, using whatever outlet you have to point to this type of content, to point to this thing on YouTube. So if you're on Twitter, like, hey, I have this video, and even just taking like a screenshot of that video, like of the title of the video or of the first scene or whatever that might be, and adding that, say, like add as an image on your tweet or on Instagram or on Facebook, like that'll drive more traffic to it than just text alone. And these are things we'll talk about next week as well. And this isn't a cop-out to come to our webinar next week, but come to our webinar next week. And we'll provide, again, more stuff in the follow-up after this.
And we'll try to address some further questions in that follow-up as well.
Yes.
I know we haven't been able to get to absolutely everything.
Yeah.
I'll add one more quick thing to that answer. When you're putting a video on YouTube, and I'm sure they'll get into this more next week too, make sure your description is good. And if you have enough space, put your entire video script, whether it's the captions or the narration, all in the description. Basically like a transcript. Put a transcript of the video in the description. That will help for SEO, for people searching for something related to that topic. And make sure maybe you hit some keywords that people might be searching for in terms of that topic online.
All right, so that's time. There are some more. We'll try maybe to get those answers in a follow-up email. If you have any questions for Sharing Science, you can email us at sharingscience@ag.org, Thriving Earth.
Earth Exchange at ag.org.
Perfect. And then again, we'll follow up in an email after this with more resources than you probably ever thought that you could would have access to. So thank you all for tuning in. We hope that we'll see you, hear from you, talk to you next week, and enjoy the rest of your day.